The genius of me coming up with this episode was to show people how your genius comes through when you're building a deck and how you decide on how you're making decisions when you're doing deck building. But now we go. I'm keeping up with the Joneses. Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Durdle Maniacs. If you want to be a Durdle Maniac, go to patreon.com/Eternal Durdles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, you ready to theory craft, bro? You ready to craft?
Yeah. Yes. So I took some inspiration from our last few videos where you were having success with miracles, and a long kind of project of mine, a deck that I've been trying to make work kind of for a very long time, but failing, is a rug control deck. This is based off the fact that back in the day, all I owned were volcanics and tropical islands. And, I got to see decks like Grixis play these control style decks. I got to say, of course, like blue, white, red, Jeskai control and stuff like that existed. But I always just wanted to see if I could get green and red to slot in with blue to be a more like mid-range control. And so, we've got to start here as far as what a deck is, a deck would look like. And I'll share that screen. There we go. All right. So, we've got a good idea here of what a deck would look like, but this isn't it, obviously, yet. So let's start with your first diagnosis of this deck, Phil.
Okay. So, I see blue cards.
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I see that you have got the my Mystic Sanctuary Thwart technology.
Yeah, I think I wanted to start there. I think that Thwart, Mystic Sanctuary, and Lauren Revealed are a powerful thing that you can do, and then it really comes down to like, what can you do with them?
Yeah, so I think a simple way that people could look at something like this and then apply it to whatever deck they're building to start is like when you ask Phil, what's your assessment of this thing? Yeah. The first thing that I'm actually looking for is, okay, what is the goal of your deck, right? What does your deck do? We've had topics of that. Like, of course, you like most often when you explain what does your deck do, people will typically respond similar to like when you're like, why is that card in your deck? And then they just read you the text of the card. I understand what cards do, right? Yeah. What I'm asking is, what is the position that you're assuming is the legacy power level thing to achieve in a game in the dark, right? So what positionally are you looking this deck to accomplish?
Great question. So the first thing I thought about, the reason why I even am thinking about red in this deck, and you can tell there are only, 5 red cards in the deck, right? Is because I think Klothys, God of Destiny, is one of those cards that's just pure inevitability if you're playing against almost any other deck, right? So the important thing about Klothys is a 3-mana god that almost is never. In fact, in this deck, it can never be a creature because of the legendary creatures in this deck. It can never be a creature. So all it's doing is accruing a mana a turn if you're hitting a land, or if you're hitting a non-land, you're draining the opponent for 2 each turn. And so to me, that's maybe not like game-endingly huge, but it is an inevitability that you throw onto the board that sets it up so that your opponent cannot get out of being killed if you can make the game last long enough.
So here's a question on the make sure you know how your cards work. True or false? Klothys, God of Destiny, can be countered by Force of Negation.
Great question. I think no. Can it?
You want to look that up?
Yeah, I guess let's find out. Can gods
first
be
things
countered?
First, everyone. When you're playing, well, different gods have different conditions as to what turns them into a creature. So when you play cards in your deck and you're like, this is a critical juncture of how my deck is going to operate, understand what tools are good and bad against that thing, because you want to be able to plan accordingly for what will matter, right?
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel. Let's see. Negate will not counter a Theros god.
Yeah, because they are technically creatures in play. They don't become creatures because they have that static ability. But on the stack, they're creatures. It's similar to like, Grist is a creature on the stack, so it can't be forced negation, right?
A null could counter it. Negate could.
A null could counter it because it is an enchantment. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so you're thinking Klothys, God of Destinies, is the spot where. Tell me, Zach. It is inevitability. What are? Okay, so you're saying that let's put this under ABC threshold, right? Okay, so Klothys is your legacy power level thing to do.
We could say that. I mean, I wouldn't say that
that's what you just said, right?
I wouldn't say that Klothys is the legacy power level thing to do. Klothys is the inevitability that makes red worth playing in a control deck, right? That's where my head's at here. I don't think that Klothys is the legacy power level thing to do as much as it is something that is totally uninteractable. So I guess if you can get this onto the board, then it is the legacy power level thing to do. Let's go with that thought process for now.
I have a question for you on the context of you have the only red cards that you have in your deck are the Klothys and 3 Lightning Bolt.
Sure.
My question is, to the extent that you're playing these cards, is there a reason to do this instead of being a 3-color splash red and moving into white, and then you have access to reliable removal for things that go long? And I bring this up as if you're saying that you want the game to go long enough that Klothys, God of Destiny, can actually convert you the inevitability of a win condition. Yeah. That presumes that the rest of your deck can otherwise stop or stymie anything else that would come against you. And I like right now between you have 6 counter spells, but if a creature bigger than what Bolt can cover comes through, that thing is just on the table.
Yes.
Unless you bounce it with Brazen Borrower.
This is very true, and this is also what I was most worried about with this deck when I was building it we talked about this in chat, is that red and green cannot handle big creatures. So maybe splashing into white is where we want to be, and we remove these lightning bolts. Now, something we mentioned.
I'm not saying. Hold on. I just want to say I'm not saying that red and green can't handle these things. I'm saying that if you are like, I think that the cost of going into white would be too steep on the mana base that you currently have configured, because you want to be able to support 4 Mystic Sanctuary. I'm not saying that you have to move into white to solve these problems. I'm saying white is just like an easy solve because it has Source of Plowshares and Prismatic Ending and such, and Leyline Binding if you moved into that space. But then you're really, once you move into Leyline Binding, you really have to ask yourself if you're playing green, why you're not just playing up the beanstalk, which then builds itself. Yeah. So I'm not saying that red and green can handle these things. I'm sure there are cards that exist in a space where, like, that can. The question is, what are those cards? And then what do those cards also require in your deck building that would make it so that they're reliably turned on? I'm sure there's powerful fight spells. I see you have Uro, but like I'm navigating a way to, you have a spread of creatures that are some of which are gotcha, some of which are long game control, and then some of which are more tempo based that you would very rarely think in a control thesis would ever make sense. Yeah. And by that, it's like Brazen Borrower, like removing something from the board and then being a 3/1 threat. Good card, but like it really struggles to meet the I'm trying to solve problems forever, rather, which is so that tension is with Klothys, right? Like Klothys is like, I need to be here forever. Like your opponent will eventually bleed out, but like I got to be here for a long time. Brazen Borrower is not trying to be here for a long time, right?
Now, Brazen Borrower is a suture to the pre-mentioned problem, is that there's not a lot that we have that can deal with, say, an Atraxa or a Troll of Khazad-dûm, that sort of thing. So I was like, well, at least if we have bounce, right, at least we can, we have a universal thing that can at least deal with that in the short term. Again, short term not being a great solution, but that's where I was with Brazen Borrower. Now, something I think I should also mention, Phil, is I built this in a more mid-range manner off of looking at something like Grixis Control and seeing what tools that Grixis Control had, and saying, okay, well, since we don't have access to Orcish Bowmasters, what can we slot into that space, right? And so that's where Hull Breacher comes into play. That's where Tamio, Inquisitive Student, is a card that they run 3 to 4 of in their deck. That that's a card that can put pressure on the opponent in the early game in a way that is more skewed toward control, as opposed to say a DRC or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, my question when it comes for any time that there's a control trail where we're looking at something like Hull Breacher, the contention becomes why Hull Breacher instead of Narset?
Yeah,
this isn't me saying that Narset is better. I'm just saying for what it is that your deck's trying to do. Right now, I see the build has a lot of disparate pieces that are trying to do different things in different positions. Now that can be good if they're lined up properly.
Yeah.
What I think typically will come down to is okay, Tamio, Lightning Rod absorbs some bulk of removal. Hull Breacher, if they're not playing around it, it's a gotcha. Gotchas are fine, but once a gotcha is known, it's really hard to then stick it after the fact, unless it's a prison piece and we're in a low resource situation. So I look at these things and I'm like, okay, well, Uro isn't really going to absorb that much removal if it's not white.
Sure.
Tamio will absorb removal. Hull Breacher is going to absorb some removal. So if you're playing a control game, it's going to be really hard for counter magic, which has to solve all the problems your tools that are in your deck otherwise can't. In this case, thick creatures.
Yeah.
And that means that if you won't be able to then use your counter magic to fight over the removal on things that are otherwise supposed to win the game, if they're also stressed under the duress of having to solve problems that the deck otherwise can't solve. So if they put if somebody were to cast Barrowgoyf, for example, it's going to be tough for your deck to solve that if it's a 5/6 or a 6/7.
Yeah.
These are just things I'm throwing out to think about. The other contextual thing that is going to do is when you're trying to line pieces up in a certain way, when certain parts of your deck have to line up against certain parts of things because there isn't catch-alls. So, for example, when I play Swords to Plowshares, I know Swords to Plowshares is going to remove whatever creature it is. So, that has the entire swath of, as long as a creature doesn't have hexproof, this Swords to Plowshares is going to deal with it, right? It just covers a much wider spread, which by that wider spread, what that inherently does, even though it doesn't do it at face value, what it inherently does is it also takes stress off of your cantrips.
Yeah.
Your cantrips are going to be stressed otherwise to be able to put the proper pieces together. And the more narrow your pieces are, the tighter the margin that your cantrips have to be able to navigate your positions through. And that can be tough in a format as fast as this, where you really don't have time to sit around, right?
Yeah,
if there is a
fixed
beater on the table that's going to accrue value, you kind of need to just have it. And if Dress Down isn't going to cover some of that space, Dress Down's good against certain aspects, but a lot of the time, Dress Down in combination with a white spell that has a broader scope can solve those problems. Well, all of these cards are good cards. I'm just thinking, what is the role of all these cards and how do they come together? Dress Down also, if it ever touches the board and turns off your Klothys, then Klothys can be Swords to Plowshares.
This is also true. Yeah. And I feel
little things to think about, and where your opponent can catch you that you may not, the understanding these all these little interactions.
Well, I feel like Dress Down is a concession to not playing white here. Because if we can't stop, and it has other applications against Doomsday, against Breakfast, but in this particular scenario where you're trying to figure out ways around stuff that might be too big for Bolt, or that get in the moment you might be able to stop them from getting the value out of a reanimated creature or something like that. This is one of those cards that I felt was necessary because we didn't have access to Swords to Plowshares. Now, if we add another color, and again, that's going to be hard to do.
My question on that, though, is there for that example, is this an experiment that you're is there a world where you could play this type of deck in a format as fast and given the context of the meta, where we're actively trying to avoid white? Is that one of your guardrails of I don't want white in this deck?
I'm not trying to avoid that in particular. I just felt obviously the thesis of this is can Rug be a control color? But if we want to make this deck work, the real question is, can we add white can we add a fourth color to a Mystic Sanctuary deck becomes the question, right?
Yeah, well, this is going back to foundational. Like, what is your deck trying to do?
Yeah.
If your deck wants to be a Mystic Sanctuary Thwart loop deck that has Uro as its win condition, in which case it needs to support double green and all these islands, and then we're really in a tight space for like, okay, we're just going to have to like build our mana base in such a way where we're going to be way more exploitable to Blood Moon. If that's a risk that we're willing to take to offset what we think is a powerful way to attack a format, then you make those concessions.
Sure.
Part of what a control deck is going to have to do is not every tool can cover everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like if we are picking the tools to fight a given metagame, if we think that Blood Moon and Blood Moon type effects are at a low or in a position where we think that Lorien Revealed plus some Hydroblasts in the board, can cover that, right? Like if you're like, okay, we're going to be super soft to Blood Moon type effects, so we have to over-index for that in Hydroblast. And I say, okay, then you also have to be able to over-index for that against Harbinger of the Tides, or Harbinger of the Seas now.
Yeah.
Right. There are more of those kinds of effects. So like, is there enough things that you're willing to concede in your sideboard in order to solve those problems? Maybe.
Yeah.
But like, what like essentially, this question can boil down more basically to, what do you think the role of this particular kind of shell is doing better than something else that you go, this is worth doing beyond the thought experiment of can Rug exist as a control shell?
Yeah.
Well,
right.
Like, so like if the draw is, I think Klothys has the inevitability, and being able to interact with somebody's graveyard en route to that is beneficial in this format given XYZ. Okay, cool. Like then we explore that space, and it just happens to be that like I want to pair red green with blue, and that's what gets us into Rug. If the context of the meta is we're in nothing but fast combo and Ancient Tomb, I go that the Klothys hypothesis is just like, we can test it. We can run into a bunch of the things where it doesn't interact and get stomped and go, this doesn't seem like it's the correct time for the world that we're in. Because if we don't have the tools to somehow slow the game down dramatically.
Yeah, I guess the question I would approach this is what does this deck even prey on, right? Like if we're in a metagame where this deck is good, what does that metagame even look like, right? So
let's talk about that.
Yeah. So my consensus here is that this deck is good in a metagame where other tempo decks are the thing to be preying upon, right? And we're not there yet. We're approaching that. We're Delvers back in the meta, and like even the Esper tempo and Esper control decks, like this could have game against them perceivably, because we're able to deal with Orcish Bowmasters. We can punish their brainstorm plays, even in a situation where it's just Reanimator, right? We're in a situation where Klothys is main deck graveyard hate to some extent if we're able to stave off. And we're playing Daze, we're playing Force Will, we're playing Force Negation. So we can stave off those early, like, I'm going to do the thing plays, and then follow it up with a Klothys and use that to just accrue value. And, what you were saying about the green mana base for Uro, Klothys also kind of solves that problem a little bit because it does gain you red or green mana when you exile land. So you can use it for that as well. Hey, Legacy fans, since you're enjoying the show, please like and subscribe to the video. It helps the channel grow.
Support Eternal Durdles on Patreon so we can create even more content and cover events.
Patreons get an ad-free RSS feed, 4 bonus episodes a month, and Discord recognition. Join the Durdle Maniacs at patreon.com/Eternal Durdles.
Now back to the show. In what game states is Klothys good in?
I mean,
is Klothys good in high resource or low resource?
That's tough, right? Because Klothys is literally just a thing on the board that says remove a card from the graveyard and drain for 2, right? So it's great against a tempo matchup. That is probably a low resource game at the end of the day.
Low resource? Yeah, so you think it's low resource?
I think so, yeah. I think low resource, right? Like when you're fighting a tempo deck and you slam a Klothys and they've got like a Delver on the board, right? You're not racing them per se. Well, I think technically, yeah, you are racing them, right? You're draining for 2, they're doing 3, right? Like that's the perfect state for you to be in, where you're like, eventually one of us will draw out of this, but I'm able to stabilize with this one card, right? I think, yeah, in a low resources game where you kind of card for card attack your opponent, and the rest of this deck is sort of a homage to that. Is like every one of these cards, like technically Brazen Borrowers is a 2-for-1, kind of,
It's not. It's not, and
well, it's
that's
not
what
a 2-for-1, but
that,
you are getting value out of you're getting one half of the card, then the other half of the card, right? Like you are.
it is accruing time. It's not actually accruing any value if the time that it is converting isn't actually accruing any of the value in the interim. Then there isn't actually any value accrued, right? But I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm saying that if you think that the position that Klothys is going to excel in is a low resource game, then the tools that are around it should otherwise want to simplify the game state. Now,
and now I've got Dazes,
Yeah, dude, like, yes, this is all like cards do things and they interact in ways that are hopefully beneficial. I'm saying that the choices of what are things that would simplify the game. Brazen Borrower does not simplify the game. Hull Breacher does not simplify the game.
Sure.
Tameo does not simplify the game, right?
You're
these
not
are cards that
it feels like the deck is pulling itself apart in two different ways, right? That's what you're saying.
But I'm saying that right now I see a collection of good stuff mashed into a blue shell, and that blue shell is going to be at odds with what it's trying to accomplish because you have like your actual payoff tools for what like your cantrips are not in themselves the goal of the deck, right?
No,
they are just trying to put the pieces together to solve, of course, something. So they're trying to put the pieces together, and if all of the pieces are okay, Klothys is good in high resource. Klothys is good in low resource. Hull Breacher is good in high resource. Like, then you're going to exacerbate your issue with drawing the wrong half of your deck.
Yeah.
Right? If we're in a low resource situation and you have a Hull Breacher, it's like, okay, well, they're in low resources. It's not like the gotcha of the Hull Breacher being on the table and chunking for 3 is going to be all that great, where if it was in high resource and you get a gotcha and you strand them and then make a bunch of treasures, and now you're in high resource, so you can now leverage those treasures in some way to convert a bunch of value. But if we're in low resource and they have no hand and you have no hand, and it's just like, okay, here's a 3/2, like that is not where Hull Breacher is going to shine, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, if Klothys is pecking away at a graveyard, one card a turn, but they're able to deploy a bunch of shit and do all this stuff with all of their cards and cast multiple spells a turn, like, man, that Klothys is going to feel anemic because it is just not doing enough for the mana investment.
Yeah. So I suppose let's live in a perfect world for a second where there is a red Swords to Plowshares. There's not, but like, let's just say that is where we want to be, where in the style of the way your deck is built, your Miracles deck is built, Klothys, let's say 2 Klothys is the only win condition in the deck, right? We're playing those two of those, and then we have the rest of the threats here are gone, and they are interaction that make the game longer in some capacity.
Okay, well, I mean, if one card that is closer to Swords to Plowshares in red is something like Galvanic Discharge is can be pretty beefy. Unholy Heat can be pretty beefy. Now, it's not going to solve Atraxa, but there are tools that can get creatures bigger than Bolt, and if your choice of I want the game to go forever, then the reach on Bolt is not necessarily as necessary, right? You're not trying to inch across the finish line. You're trying to just have inevitability to the point where it doesn't. If we get to a position in the game where you just want your opponent to be like, oh well, I got nothing left, and I will eventually die to the Klothys. Not like, oh, here's the narrow window where I'm going to get him. I'm going to just get him to 2. Like, my goal is to get him to 2, because then Klothys is going to close the door because they're going to be at 2. Like, okay, yeah, if the goal is to get them to 2, that's different, right? But if your goal is, I just want to, handle every threat that comes my way, and then Klothys will eventually get there, that's a very different
for sure
target than what the alternative would be.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the flaws in this plan too is that in comparison to your plan, right, is that the Lorien Revealed Lorien Revealed Mystic Sanctuary Thwart plan, right, inherently sets you up to have a quote unquote infinite number of win cons, secure the waste or deploy, what have you. That doesn't actually work for Klothys, right? It works for Lightning Bolt technically, but like that's not where we want to be. We don't want to just be like, I'm gonna Lightning Bolt you to death, right? So I think maybe at the end of the day, the thesis here being that like Klothys might be the thing I want to do. Now, there are two possible answers here. Klothys is perhaps not the control card I want it to be, right? Or it's that this deck shouldn't play Klothys. If I want to be a rogue control deck, maybe I shouldn't be playing Klothys.
Well, I would think that it's just okay. When we say control, there are different things that you can do to be a control deck. Right now, it looks like the control deck that you want to be, from my POV, is hinging on Mystic Sanctuary being able to recur everything that you need.
Yeah, indeed.
That
is compelling. To me. Yeah,
it is compelling, and it is at odds with with a bunch of the things that you have otherwise. Like you can't recur a win condition with Mystic Sanctuary. That is diluting how powerful Mystic Sanctuary can be.
Correct.
Dress Down, which is presumably solving a specific problem in your mind as to why it's included, doesn't have, like, Mystic Sanctuary can't interact with the Dress Down in any way. That dilutes power of Mystic Sanctuary. Like, it's okay to dilute the power level of certain aspects of a deck in order to put it elsewhere, but hopefully that's not leaving any major gaps where you're then going, oh man, like if this were something else, or if these two facets of my deck, somehow were interlocked in a way that I had access to over the course of a longer game, that would prove beneficial. That's, like you do have like Witness the Future as a way to like recur things back into your library.
Of course.
And then Mystic Sanctuary can put that in. But we also know, I know, having cast Witness the Future probably more than anybody else in Legacy at this point, it's not a Legacy playable card, right? Yeah. It's a holdover because there's literally nothing better in blue. But
sure.
You're in green. Like if you wanted that sort of space, there is something like Gaia's Blessing that can recur. You're in green. You could lean harder and just be Endurance, which actually is a Legacy playable card. Now, the different aspects of like what a controlling deck could be, in this instance, you're a Mystic Sanctuary build, but the payoffs that you want to go towards are not something that Mystic Sanctuary leans into, right? If you want to pay off like Klothys as a control shell, then it's like, there are other aspects that I think you could lean into, which is, if you're on days and you think that Klothys and Ur are the payoffs, then why aren't we doing something in the space similar to like the old, Mana Dork in a TNN Days of Old type shell that Reduke piloted to a GP win?
Sure.
Where he would just go, you would go Mana Dork into powerful 3-drop.
Stoneforge deck. Yeah, of course.
He played Leovold and TNN off of Mana Dorks with Days because he was the Mana Dork on turn 1 offset the discount on Days, so you could still hit 3-drops. Like there's natural tension between Days and 3-drops, and so like being able to sort of bridge that gap with your Mana Dorks that hopefully have other text. You like happen to your 3-drops outside of Hull Breacher can move into the legendary space. Perhaps maybe you move into something of that space, right? Like there is that world where you're like, I want to play tap out control. That means that I need to be able to get some sort of mana advantage to propel these 3-drops that should be overwhelming in their power level and command a game, and I'm gonna lean harder that way. You could move into a Green Sun Zenith package, and that can give you controlling elements with this tool that otherwise just can constantly find a bullet. You can play a bullet type control shell. Like there's a difference between an inevitability control shell and a toolbox control shell. There are the tools to do that, and then you can figure out how you build around that axis, which is like it's like Mystic Sanctuary versus Green Sun, right? There are ways where you can follow the Klothys line and be like, even if you only have 1 or 2 Klothys in your deck, the game plan can still be, I want all of my tools to somehow get me to a way where I eventually win with Klothys. That can be the starting point or the goal and thesis for a deck, even if it isn't the thing that happens all the time, right? Like my Miracles list where I'm playing Mystic Sanctuary for it, I do have ways that I can win the game, but they're usually like any win condition that I put into my deck, I try to have it have some sort of value outside of being otherwise able to win the game. In this case, it's a Graveyard Hate. Great. I have Graveyard Hate that incidentally also wins me the game. Yeah. When I put Depose Deploy in my current list, that's not a Legacy playable card, and it's really in my deck because I wanted life gain somewhere in the deck.
Yeah. And it's a blue instant for
Merchant Scroll, which is part of where my thesis is going on, where we're exploring here. But like that notion is like it's not a win condition first; it's incidentally a win condition. Like if I had my druthers and people understood and cared about their own time, then I wouldn't have a win condition in the deck, because Thwart Mystic Sanctuary just deterministically means you can't deck. Okay, as long as you have access to your graveyard, that's cool. That's a win condition. You can be like, I will not deck. You will deck first. Decking can be your win condition if you're a control deck of players who are willing to concede. We had the conversation where they're not. So like, I think that like as you're looking at these tools, they're like you said, they're pulling you in different directions. Thinking about what is the position that you're looking to do. Like if you were to sit in the dark in the blind and open your hand, how would you know what to keep?
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think I would know what to keep. A random hand for this? Let's look. Let's just do it, right? Let's take this discharge out because it's not in the deck. And we can, thanks to Moxfield, we can actually do this, right? So we're looking at an absolutely terrible opener here. So let's mulligan. And okay, so we look at this, and this seems fine-ish, right? Not great because you still have the Mystic Sanctuary coming into play tapped, but you have a force and a land and some brainstorms. You probably actually want to start with the Mystic Sanctuary so that you can brainstorm just for selection, right?
And it's fine. You have force of will, so like it's not like you're entirely shields down when you play the opening land. And then okay, if you're thinking that, it's like okay, the plan is going to be if you keep this hand and you're like I have to force on turn one. What are you pitching? You have to pitch Hull Breacher, right?
Yeah, you would have to pitch. You would most definitely have to pitch Hull Breacher, right?
So if this was a Bolt of 6, that means that you just have to put Klothys down to the bottom, which is fine.
Yeah.
But like that's the starting point of the deck. But now that the thing is, this is what I mean though, when figuring out like if you know that your deck can't solve certain problems, that the weight on that force of will is just heavier, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't draw to certain things that
you can't. Any creature that comes into play that you need to get rid of, you got a force of will, especially if it has a 4-butt, right?
But what I mean by like that opening hand, the previous hand where you had the force plus the brainstorm, because we know that there are certain things that the tools in your deck can't otherwise solve, so force of will has to make up for that disparity. That also means that when you're brainstorming, it's going to be really hard to put back that force of will.
Agreed.
If you know that if your opponent shows themselves as like, oh shit, they have swamp in their deck, I have to now think about Barrowgoyf, and hopefully they don't show it to me. But if they do, I now have to have this force of will committed to that line until I'm pressured to do something else.
Yeah.
Right? Because I can't draw out of a Barrowgoyf touching the table. It just can't touch the table. Now, if that means that my force of will is compelled to do that, that means that my brainstorm can't get rid of that force of will, and I need to have a blue card kept in my hand as well. Now my force of will is now pressured, is more heavily pressured, and my cantrips are more heavily pressured because I don't have the same volume to be able to put cards back with the brainstorm because I have to support this force of will. So like the combination of those two things together puts a lot of weight on that hand, and that hand then becomes even more inflexible on top of a mulligan to 6, right? So like in ways where brainstorm were otherwise supposed to like solve your problems, it's really hard to solve your problems when all of the other cards have so much bearing load that they have to take on. That it's like it's similar like we when talking about this before in other times where I've talked about when Brain Surge came out and was talking about how just having more brainstorms just alleviates the pressure of being able to enable miracles. It's because when brainstorm has the inherent good part of what blue cantrips do, which is drawing the right half of your deck and like making sure that you have what you need in the time that you need it, like that's the power of it, right? Consistency. The blue cantrip suite offers consistency, but the second that you add anything that adds more weight, more bearing load to those cards, like Terminus, well now
like
not
immediately
only
you have to worry about getting rid of cards that you don't want and setting up miracles, so that adds 2 layers to your brainstorm.
So, the first layer on the brainstorm is to do what is there in the first place, which is to fix hands, right?
Yeah.
So that card selection, that's inherently what the card is there to do in the first place. And anything on top of that becomes an additional layer of load that it now has to account for, which just applies more stress to when you can use it and how to use it. And the more and more that you tack onto that by adding pressure onto other aspects of cards that are in your deck, it'll make it feel like where you're like, man, this deck sucks. And it's like, well, it may not suck. It may just be that there's too much load bearing on too many of the cards that there just isn't enough space for within the allotment of what your opponent's doing. Because if your opponent doesn't have that kind of load bearing on their cards and just can throw shit in the way, then you're going to be like, man, their deck is just so much more powerful than mine. Not really. It's just like, man, I can't really afford to fight over this, Baleful Strix.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just going to be a thing until I figure out, like, I have no way to, like, favorably trade with that, or I don't want to waste a resource on that. And your deck, outside of Uro, has no card advantage outside of Lorien Reveal. So it's like, okay, well, if I trade with that Strix, I'm down the card, but it's okay because I can offset by gaining that card elsewhere.
Yeah.
It's like when I'm playing, like, when I play Predict is going to go up a card. So if I make an exchange that goes down a card, it's a pawn exchange, right? Like, if I give you a pawn in the early game, it's okay if it gives me positional advantage because I can get if later on I can recoup that pawn. It's okay that you got a pawn earlier if we're still at parity.
Well, Phil, I wanna end this episode by using the word genius twice, one loosely and one a bit more heavily. The genius of me coming up with this episode was to show people how your genius comes through when you're building a deck and how you decide on how you're making decisions when you're doing deck building. And, Rug Control, obviously not the greatest example here, but it gives a lot of holes for you to punch through to show people, like, here's what I think about when I'm building a deck. So my low level genius was able to draw out your high level genius, which to me was a win for this episode.
I appreciate you thinking such things. I'm just like in the thing of, like, this sort of seems like, if you just go, like, sort of sift down what the cards are, like, what the text boxes are doing, and it's like, if you can just get beyond, like, the like, this card does these things and it's a powerful thing, and, like, more towards what the topic of conversation that I want to do in a future episode, which is just thinking about what your deck does as a plan beyond the individual tools that are within it.
Yeah.
Right? Because it can be really hard to be like, okay, well, if you mulligan and then you're like, well, I really want to put back, I'm already on a 6-card hand and I don't want to have force something that puts me down. But if you're like, well, I know where the weaknesses are in my deck. Like, of course, there's always going to be the outliers where, like, you run into, like, turn 1 combo and have to spend your force on whatever to not die. That's boring and uninteresting. Of course, you have to do the things to not die. But if a game is going to be somewhat interactive, or you have to pick and choose your spots, knowing where those force rules are supposed to line up and what to fight over, like, if there are times where, like, I'll play if I'm playing against, like, I don't know, I think recently, because it's coming to mind, I was playing against another control player, and there was just a bad, like, I played counterbalance and then they wanted to fight over counterbalance, and I could have fought back. But I'm like, that's the game. This game is not like, the things that this force is compelled to fight over is not protecting the counterbalance. It's to fight over things that counterbalance otherwise can't check.
To stop Narset, to stop, yeah, of course.
To stop those things, right? So it's like, I'm not fighting, like, the counterbalance is not the thing that's going to take me there in this matchup. Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm up against Delver, right, where the game plan is like, if I have this counterbalance on the table, then I'm like, I'm snapping. Like, if I go counterbalance on 2 and they don't daze it, right? Like, sometimes they'll go counterbalance on the play against the day's opponent if they haven't put a threat down, just to set them back an additional turn, so they can't, like, they're not going to wasteland me if they're behind by 2 lands, right? That doesn't make any sense. They're going to redeploy that land, either find a threat or cantrip for a threat, and then play to follow up on the second thing, or they're going to build up to a Murktide with protection, right? So, like, if I run out a counterbalance, if I happen to be on the play, which is just, I'm advantaged already because I'm on the play. If they spend their first turn cantripping and then I counterbalance and throw it into a daze, I'm okay making that exchange because it's going to give me time to, like, accrue later. The combat stuff is not going to be relevant for 2 more turns.
Yeah.
If I'm on the draw, that may be a different thing. But, like, all that is to say, if I go counterbalance on turn 2 and they force it, I'm not forcing that back, right? Yeah. They haven't shown me that they have the daze, which means that, like, when they deploy a threat, this counterbalance on the table is going to dictate the terms of the game. I will control the narrative if I have that counterbalance.
Because what Maniac throws out, like, there's no way that as a Delver player, my mindset is, if you throw down a counterbalance and I have a daze and a force of will, I'm always going to daze it first. Right?
Here's the thing: in that position of, like, this idea of, like, knowing where your forces are, how your forces are supposed to line up against certain things, and what your decks are otherwise soft to, is, even if they were on some sort of weird next level galaxy brain nonsense, whatever, And they were like, actually, I don't want to pick up this land off this days because I don't have this threat down, and I really do actually need to leverage the thing. And if I, present now the story that I don't have days, maybe they walk into the days later. Like, I can see argument for doing these
Sure,
things
of course.
contextually if they're like, I'm actually playing this 2-drop that I, want to test out, and therefore I don't want to. There's a whole bunch of different things that they could do. But if I went turn 2 counterbalance, and then they went force pitch blue card, I'm going to force pitch blue card even if they do have the follow up days there, because the outcome is still the same.
Yeah,
And
you've gotten rid of 3 cards from them and bought a turn.
But that's not even the target. The target is that my force of will still lined up the way that the force of will I know in the matchup is supposed to.
Yeah.
Right? My force of will is like in the Delver matchup, is there in those type of positions to force through the counterbalance. That's what it's there for. It's to accrue that sort of advantage.
That makes sense.
Where if I'm going up against somebody where I know that they're on like, if they're in up the Beanstalk build or they're a Planeswalker build or whatever, or if they're, on a bigger Grixis build, or if they're on, show and tell or whatever. Like, if I play the counterbalance and they fight over it, I'm like, good, fight over it, cool. My force of will is not pinned to doing that in that matchup. You know what I mean? But like,
please,
you have to, you should know that going in with the deck that you're playing, because you have to know in every matchup how your catch-alls, your counter magic, like force of will, should line up. Like, force of will is going to be different in every matchup. And I mean, part of why the card is so good, but like the card is only good if you know where you're supposed to line it up. Similar, I imagine, I don't play much Days Tempo, but if you're playing in a certain matchup, it's like, yeah, there's going to be the times where you're on the play and you play a threat and your opponent plays a thing, you just daze it and you just blow them out because you have all the tools, because sometimes the cards play themselves. But then there are other times where you're like, in this matchup, this daze really needs to hit this. So you're like, I'm actually not going to play my Wasteland until I'm in a position where I'm going to cut them, the turn before they would have requisite mana to get to this thing, because I need them to be able to walk into this daze. So I have to, like, 2 turns down the line, like, sort of try and set up this daze, because I know that this is the thing that this daze is pinned to, this game. Like, you have to know, like, Force of Will doesn't just say counter spell in a matchup. It should say counter target thing that you fear
specific
in a matchup.
Yeah.
And
it's funny, Phil, when you're talking about this, because I have a relatively well-positioned draft background, right? Like, I did a lot of drafting back in the day. I considered myself a limited player up until, I started playing the game again, basically. But in my early 20s, I was a limited player, right? And one of the things you do when you're building your deck for limited, especially if there is a cancel option in your thing, is you're like, okay, like, game 1, see what the opponent has. Game 2, if they have something that I cannot beat, if they have a bomb that I cannot beat, I have to side in my cancel. Cancel is often very bad in draft, because, like, who wants to counter a 2-mana goblin, whatever, a literal gray ogre with your cancel? Like, no one wants to do that. It's not a great exchange. You're just leaving mana open when you should. Almost every draft game is a tempo game, right? But in the event that you see your opponent play, like, Angel of Serenity or something like that, cancel is great. You're like, I need to cancel that for sure. I can't have, my opponent just dropping a 7-mana bomb late game against me that, like, I could answer with a card that is otherwise not great, but, like, does solve a specific problem. And especially in draft, there are 40 cards instead of 60. You're more likely to see that card. That whole thing, In team draft, it's even a bigger deal, because your cohorts are going to see that card more often. That's a whole other thing. But this episode is sort of like a beyond ABC deck building episode, where, like, you're able to, like, really deconstruct the concept of ABC deck building for this one particular scenario, but then step beyond, like, ABC deck building and really give, like, a really good idea about, like, why you're making these choices when you're building the decks. Not just like, oh, if A, then B, then C. It's like, if A, but why are we even choosing A? Like, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, ABC is the theory of ABC deck building is really, if you, like, sift it down, it's just like the simplest form of log lining what your deck is trying to do, right? Like, there's all the stuff in between those things and, like, how they're supposed to interlock with each other. But, like, the other thing that, like, now that I have your deck list in my head here, it's just like, there are also certain things where it's like, unless your deck is trying to do something proactive in common, like Hull Breacher, and then the similar cards that are like it, if they aren't just good on rate, like a 3/2 flash is just not good on rate, right? Like, you're not playing that for the rate.
Yeah.
Where something like Bowmaster, you could just play on rate, right? Like even if it doesn't, it's not gonna, it may not be the 10 out of 10 that it will be when its text box is insane, but like you can just play the flash 2 drop that puts in 2 threats and pings an opponent or can ping a target, right? Like that just on rate is good enough because it's in the context of the metagame and the fact that black is good. Like that is good. A 3-mana flash 3/2 is not. Now that flash mana 3/2 is way more powerful if you incidentally have Days Undoing in your deck, right? That is also to say that unless you as a control deck are really trying to target something specific in the metagame, like you're like, I anticipate as the control deck, I'm running into this, and therefore I need to really prioritize solving that problem. We saw a control deck top 8, I forget what it was, but it was a Japanese player who played, he was playing Jeskai Miracles, control, whatever, but he had 3 consigns main board, right? Now, you don't just, like, consign is not in itself an intrinsically good enough card, right? Like, it is not the same catch-all that Force of Will is when it comes down to what a counter magic is good in a deck.
Not even as good as Stifle,
Like it's just like one of those things. Like you can tell that like this person put 3 consigns in their main board because they're like, I anticipate running into this. They're making a matchup lottery prediction,
of course,
and then hedging against that, and that's great. Totally cool. If you think you have a metagame read and you can beat your opponents before you get to the table, awesome. Do it. We've seen that with like Delver players where they'll play a Pyroblast main because they think they're trying to get ahead of the meta as opposed to playing like a Chain Lightning or whatever. Okay, cool. You're making a hedge call. But like that is different. Like a metagame call is different than a deck building analysis from step 1, where like Hull Breacher, way better of a sideboard card, right? That's a 10 or a 2 depending on the matchup you're in, right? So the moment that I see it in a main board, that would red light itself to being, okay, so you anticipate running into like, Echo of Eon's decks or some shit, like you're clearly targeting something by playing 3 Hull Breacher in your main board here. That is a commitment to a thing. Whereas like, Uro is just a generically good control card, right? Like it just does stuff, and whether or not your opponent's there, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to draw the card, it's going to replace itself, it's going to put a land into play. That's going to happen no matter what opponent you're playing across from. How you line up the other tools is all whatever, but like Uro is otherwise extremely boring, right? It does the same thing always, but that also makes it a good main board card because you're like, in the dark, it's just always going to do the thing I set it up to do. Baleful Strix is always going to do the thing I set it up to do. Like those are the consistent main deckable cards where in the dark you can go, well, against an opponent that, is going to be the swath of the metagame that I anticipate. Now, if we're in a warped metagame where you're like, I anticipate running into nothing but blue-black Reanimator 50% of the time, and you're like, okay, well, if I'm running into a 10-round event and 5 of my rounds are going to be against blue-black Reanimator, I want to be able to hedge against that, so I'm going to play a main board, graveyard, whatever my graveyard hate is. And that's what we saw when people were playing Nile Spellbombs. It's
funny that you mentioned this right now because one of our comments on the video that came out today, we're recording this on the Tuesday before this came out, so 7 days prior, Phil put out that video about Merchant Scroll deck, right? And some people were asking in the comments, if your deck is so weak to Blood Moon, why aren't you playing like a one of Hydroblast, right? That you could conceivably Merchant Scroll for the Hydroblast to stop the stop that from hitting the board. What a great time to answer that question, Phil.
I have a Hydroblast in the sideboard.
Yeah, but what about main deck where like, and so here's why I asked this. If you anticipate, and this is what I commented, if your metagame is rancid with Stompy, then you want to do that. Mine is right. Yours is not. You have a gentleman's agreement at your local that most people play blue decks, in some fashion. My metagame is absolutely rancid, and I don't know why. It's a proxy metagame. People are allowed to play whatever they want, and they still play Red Stompy like savages. But and shout out to the cats who do. I love you guys. You're good people. Aside from the fact that you play Red Stompy, but right there, that's a great position where you want to say, hey, maybe in my deck that can fetch, with Merchant Skull, fetch a Pyroblast. That's where I want to be, or Hydroblast, I should say. That's where I want to be.
Yeah, totally. If I anticipated that's where the metagame was, like right now, I anticipate right now that like there's risk rewards in those positions, right? You're like, if I'm I'm playing the Merchant Scroll, therefore I can slot this Hydroblast in, and then I'm mitigating how many times I'm going to naturally draw that Hydroblast, even if I But if I think that I'm going to run into nothing but Red Stompy and I want to play a Hydroblast main board, yeah, of course I would do that. My list currently, I have a Piracy Charm main.
Yeah.
That Piracy Charm, like I'm not playing that Piracy Charm because I'm like, oh man, Piracy Charm's so good. I'm playing it because I want an out specifically to Orcish Bowmasters, and then the floor against the rest of the format. I also anticipate running into a lot of Nadu, and it's like, okay, well, yeah,
as long as you're not just blind casting into Reanimator decks.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, it's in the deck for a specific reason. It's in the deck because I want to be able to have a main deck, more main deck answers to Bowmaster. That I can act at instant speed. That way, when they flash in the Bowmaster, I can clip it before it domes me for a quarter of my life total, which something like Prismatic Ending can't do. Right? Yeah. They would have to commit the Bowmaster first, and then have to take the damage, then have to untap, then have to commit at sorcery speed. Like that sucks. The only thing I have is Source of Plowshares. And if we're going, okay, I have four of my things to line up against four of your things, and then we have to line up our counter magic. But like my counter magic is way more stressed than the Bowmaster player's counter magic typically, because they're the ones that can just protect the queen in that position. So like, of course they can line up a position where, similar to what I was talking about with counterbalance, they can be like, this Force of Will is protecting my Bowmaster. It's like, okay, well now I need to either save my counter magic,
another interaction and another Force of Will.
But now my counter magic is more stressed because mine is the reactive. They control the narrative in that position, which is a whole other episode, which we've talked about. Yeah. But okay. So now they have the narrative, and we even at equal, if we have equal things, right? Like they have both the threat and the counter magic. I have the removal and the counter magic. They are still in the position because my removal is inherently only good when they deploy the threat. So they control the narrative in that spot. My Source of Plowshares is never going to control the narrative inherently. Because I can't deploy my Source of Plowshares proactively, so I can't control that narrative.
That is a whole nother episode. What's the difference between who controls narrative and who's the beatdown?
But that idea of like, why don't you play the Hydroblast main? If I thought I was running into nothing but Mono Red Stompy, of course, yeah. Right now, I think I'm going to run into a lot of Bowmaster, but I can just move that slot around if I need to, and I'm using the Merchant Scroll to up my consistency and to dilute me from drawing the cards that I otherwise don't want to draw outside of those positions. I don't want to draw the Piracy Charm all the time. I want to draw it exactly when they have when I'm playing against a Bowmaster pilot in the positions where I suspect that there's going to be a Bowmaster battle. Now, the floor is that like, okay, I can mitigate how bad the card is because it has some crossover in the current metagame. Like, it's nice that it can hit a Nomad's Encore or a Cephalid Illusionist. That's a nice bonus, but it is not the reason why it's in the deck. But it does inform my choice as to why I'm willing to include it, because it's good against, anything base black, which I anticipate going to be Bowmaster, and a bunch of the Nadu decks, which are all going to have Nomads Encore in them. So regardless of the Nadu build, it's going to have Nomads. So I'm like, okay, it's good against Bowmaster, and it's also good against this other large percentage of the field. And the floor, the very, very, very lowest floor on the card is its Raven's Crime. Is Raven's Crime playable? No, but it's a blue Raven's Crime, so it's pitchable. And Raven's Crime at its floor isn't the lowest floor possible.
And you can get into a scenario where you're just recurring Raven's Crime during your opponent's turn. Like,
dude, I was playing against Storm the other day, and they cast their last ritual on the stack before what was obviously going to be the tutor that they were going to follow up with to then storm out, and I caught them. Right,
nice.
Like, okay, yeah. Now they're not playing around Piracy Charm. I'm also not trying to play in a position where I get the Piracy Charm in that spot. Yeah, Piracy Charm can pick and choose its spots when you have it, and you know that, like, okay, here's an option that it has available. But that's what I mean. That is an escalation. That is an elevation of the floor for that card to be main deck. Where it's like, same thing. If you're like, oh man, like Hydroblast is really good against the Red Stompy decks, and also what's really abundant right now? Rug Delver. Yeah, and what's like having an additional out to DRC is great, awesome. There's the floor has been elevated. So. Yeah, you can pick and choose those risk rewards, but I think before you can get to, like, okay, how low is the floor on a card, you have to be looking to solve a problem, right? Yeah. And then it's like, okay, then what is the best way to solve that problem with the highest floor?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. So with that said, I want to give a shout out to Dim Wombat 7788 who put that comment out on the comment section of the last video we did. Comment below, how would you fix this deck? One, right? Like, do you have a plan? Do you think that rug control could be a thing? What am I missing? What theory crafting idea did Phil and I both miss? And then two, I don't know, Phil, what question would you ask?
I would ask you to look at your own deck and see if you discovered anything about how, if you're brewing, what's the goal? What's the position that your deck's trying to be? You just like, oh yeah, I recognize now that like this pile of tools is just not conducive to a plan.
Yeah. This was supposed to be like a 30-minute video. We're into 50 minutes. Thank you everybody for watching, and we will catch you on the flip. Have a good one, everybody. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button. It grows the legacy content ecosystem we all love by relaying to the platform that you are part of our passionate community.
And to go even further, click the links for subscription or to support directly via Patreon to help us create more content for you. Patreon supporters get 4 exclusive extra episodes per month. If you're listening on an audio platform, head over to patreon.com/eternaldurdles.
Thanks so much for your support.
We'll see you in the next one.